So thank you all for coming and for attending this coffee hour, the 24-month STEM OPT extension session workshop that we'll be talking about today. To start, if I can go to the next slide here, I just wanted to say a couple words about myself, my experience. My name is Emily Fritz. I am an advisor here at the ISSO. A lot of what I do is also on the back end in our database. So I do a lot of the CVIS reporting. Currently, I am the person that takes care of all of the 6, 12, 18, 24-month STEM reporting requirements for our STEM extension students. So if you are currently on STEM extension, or if you are eligible and plan to apply for STEM extension, we will definitely be interacting at some point. I do want to say I have an adorably cute rescue dog. So I did have to, of course, put a picture of her here. Her name is Coco. I've been an advisor at the ISSO for probably about 5 years now, and I am happy to always be working with the students here at UMass Lowell. And if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me. My information is on the website, and we can go ahead and get started on this presentation. Thanks again for joining. So I do want to start by just kind of opening up and saying that there are a lot of resources that are already available to you on the ISSO website, as well as some other resources that I'll be talking about today. Two main areas of the STEM OPT extension are Form I-983, which we'll be going over more in depth, as well as the routine reporting requirements that are required for students that are on STEM extension. Both of these areas can be complex. Specifically with the Form I-983, this is a new form that was created back in 2016, and there's specific instructions on how to complete the form as well as how to maintain the form. So please do be sure to review the ISSO website for the specific codes that you need when completing the I-983, and then also to review the DHS instructions that are provided. It's actually a PDF form that I've linked here. It's linked on our website on the I-983 section of the STEM webpage of our website. And it literally lists each field of the Form I-983 and how it should be completed. With most government forms, or maybe all government forms, you never want to just try to complete it without carefully following the instructions. Of course, something as simple as last name, surname, first name, middle name, something like that you can easily answer, but there's a lot of nuances when completing government forms. So we just always want to make sure that you are aware of the resources available to you so that you can complete the form successfully. If you don't complete the form correctly, it often delays some things, maybe applying for receiving your initial STEM I-20, or just trying to make a report that is time sensitive. Things are going to get delayed if the I-983 is not completed correctly or maintained correctly. The reporting requirements are equally as important and very much related to the Form I-983, because a lot of the reporting requirements are involved with updating and maintaining that I-983. Usually when there's a report that needs to be made to ISSO, it is going to be about the I-983, and the I-983 will need to be updated and maintained as well. So we do have a web page on our website that's dedicated to the STEM reporting requirements. And I think it's pretty good. I have a screenshot of it that I'll be going over, but I also really love the way that the Study in the States page actually breaks down the STEM reporting requirements. I feel like it's easy to navigate, and it breaks it down into sections. And so that's a page that I frequently go to. I have things, before we went remote, I used to have them all over my office space. And I think this web page is fantastic. I would actually recommend that you go ahead and favorite both of these two pages under the reporting requirements, which is the ISSO STEM Extension Reporting Requirements page, as well as that Study in the States DHS website for reporting requirements. Two very awesome resources that I would want you to be aware of. I can't tell you how many times in a day I do respond to questions about, okay, how do I make this report? I want to make my 6-month report. I want to make my 12-month report, or I need to make an employment change. I need to report my employment change. All of the reporting forms that you will be using while on STEM Extension are linked on the forms section of our website. So it's just uml.edu/ISSO/forms. I actually would recommend that you bookmark or favorite this page as well. There's a specific section for STEM Extension that can be used for your initial application to USCIS or to ISSO for that STEM recommended I-20. And then there's another section that's specific to reporting requirements. So if you're already on STEM Extension and you want information about reporting requirements, please do go to the forms section and see that specific section for what types of forms are available to you and which one you need to support and to complete and in what circumstance. So I wanted to provide an agenda to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to go over the eligibility criteria for STEM Extension to see if you are eligible. In addition to that, we'll be talking about some nuances or factors within the eligibility criteria that are talked about a lot within the field that you may experience or encounter yourself. We'll also be talking about the filing timeline, when to apply, how to apply, and I did want to add in some USCIS updates about some things that you may hear on the Form I-765 changes, or just there's been a lot of talk about the delays with receipt notices, so I will be talking about that as well. Finally, we'll be going a little bit more in depth into the Form I-983. What is it? What's required? How do I maintain it? How do I complete it, etc. And then we're going to wrap up with the fun reporting requirements. So without further ado, we'll go right into it. So STEM obviously means science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And in order to be eligible for the 24-month STEM extension, you need to have completed a bachelor's, master's, or PhD in a STEM field. How STEM is recognized by DHS, whether you're eligible or not, is based on the SIP codes. And this is like a taxonomy system for degrees, for programs that you study in a university. So if you are under the impression that you are eligible for STEM extension, in most cases you may be. Where it becomes a little bit unclear is sort of some of the business programs, if you're in maybe a psychology program or any of the social sciences that, you know, it may be a little bit unclear of whether you are eligible or not. It's based not on the degree name necessarily, but it's going to be based on that SIP code that's provided on the DHS STEM list. Your SIP code, so each student that studies anywhere in the university, anywhere in the United States, is going to have somewhere on the back end a SIP code. And for F1 students and for J1 students, you're going to see that SIP code actually right on your I-20. So if you're unclear of what your SIP code is, you can look at the first page of your I-20. You'll find it next to your program of study information. And that's how we need to determine whether you're eligible or not. You can then cross-reference that against the DHS list that I've linked here. We have a link to our website. It's also posted on the STEM section of the Study in the States page that I was talking about. That's a really good resource to have. So the STEM extension is the 24-month extension of the 12-month post-OPT authorization. So again, in order to be eligible for the STEM extension for the additional 2 years of work authorization, you really need to have that be on that 12-month work authorization already and have completed a STEM master's, bachelor's, or PhD. You also need to have an offer letter by an e-verified employer. So in some cases, or in most cases, you may be on OPT and you may already be working with an e-verified employer. If you are not working for an e-verified employer, the question is going to be, can this employer become e-verified? Can we get this, will the employer actually sign up to become compliant with the E-Verify program? If the answer is no, then you may want to look for other jobs where that employer is actually signed up and compliant with the E-Verify program. So that is a requirement of the STEM extension eligibility criteria. In addition to the employer being E-Verified, you also need to make sure that the position is directly related to your field of study. That's something that we see on the 12-month OPT requirements as well. So you should always be working only in your field of study because that's a requirement of any off-campus employment authorization for the F1 status. In addition, unlike OPT, so the traditional 12-month OPT, you may be able to work in a paid or unpaid capacity once you receive your EAD. The STEM extension is different. STEM only allows for paid employment. So this means that if you're volunteering, if you're currently in an unpaid internship, that's not going to be eligible for you to apply for STEM extension through that employer. In addition to that, something that's also different than the 12-month post-OPT is that the amount of hours that you need to be employed for this employer must be at least 20 hours per week. This is different because when you're on the 12-month OPT, you're eligible to work for multiple employers, so long as altogether you're working full-time, which is at least 20 hours per week, right? So you could do 8 hours here, 6 hours here, 12 hours here. For STEM extension, you can only work for, you can only have a minimum of 20 hours for that employer. And we'll get into more of the specifics about the I-983 and why exactly that is. So 20 hours minimum per employer. If you want to do 2 employers, that's fine, but they do need to each have a minimum of 20 hours per week. Okay, so the duties, the hours, and the compensation must be commensurate with that of the employer's similarly situated U.S. workers. That's part of the Form I-983 and what the employer needs to certify. So that's going to be something that you want to bring to your employer's attention, or when they're reviewing that Form I-983, they're going to see that clause, and that is their responsibility to ensure. Of course, you may not be in a situation where you can certify this information, right? So some of this is going to be on the employer's aspect as well. And another aspect that is new sort of in after the 2016 STEM regulations is that the employer also, when they're signing the Form I-983, they need to attest to the fact that this position and you are not replacing that of a U.S. worker. That's some similarness you can see to the H-1B program and the H-1B requirements as well. To apply, you must have completed the Form I-983 in conjunction with your supervisor and submitted it to the ISSO office. One thing that changed in the 2016 requirements is when they redid the STEM program actually completely, they overhauled it in 2016, was that you can actually do STEM up to 2 times, but you cannot do it at, a 3rd time. So as you recall, you can only do STEM if you have received a bachelor's, master's, or PhD in a STEM field. So if you were to complete your bachelor's in computer science, which is a STEM field, you go on to your first 12 months of OPT, you apply for your STEM extension, you then decide that you want to go back to school for your master's, you return back to a university, do your full-time program as a master's student, and again go on OPT, and then again go on to STEM extension. That's your last chance. So it's important, especially if you're thinking about doing your entire bachelor's, master's, PhD programs here in the US, then it's important to keep that in mind so that you can plan accordingly. Okay, third-party placement. This is always a fun one. And the reason it's fun is really because it's difficult. It's really a case-by-case situation when it comes to third-party placement. So after the STEM program was temporarily suspended and it was renewed back in 2016, but it came with certain different requirements than it had been before. Previously, it was a 17-month STEM extension, and when they released the updated regulations and information regarding the STEM extension, we saw sort of a shift in USCIS's understanding of the third-party placement situations. And so they since in 2016 have sort of flip-flopped a little bit. And what we're seeing now is that USCIS is saying, you know what, these requirements we're actually going to review on a case-by-case basis by DHS. And so let me explain a little bit about what third-party placement really is. And so the third-party placement is if you're working for an employer and that employer actually, they pay you, but they are having you work at a site location. So you're going to this third party, maybe this is a company, maybe this is an agency, where you're actually physically performing that work, and that's where your work is being conducted. And so part of this can be problematic because of the way that the STEM, when they redid the STEM, they really wanted to make sure that there was oversight. They didn't want this program to just be, okay, we're going to give 2 years more of OPT to anybody that's in a STEM field. The concern was that there wasn't enough oversight of this program. And part of their solution to the lack of oversight was the Form I-983, which we'll be talking about, which really outlines the employment arrangement between the student and the employer, and how this additional 2 years of employment experience is going to provide that student with the adequate training that's required. So it's not always about, okay, you want employment. It's also about that training aspect, because it's important that's what the program was designed for. It was designed for students to be able to really put to use all of the coursework that they had partaken in and bring that to the industry, and also have some experience in the industry by working with colleagues, working with employers that are more experienced, and to provide them with sort of those internships and positions where they can learn more about their field of study, and then to return that back to their home country. So the difficult part about the third-party placement is that when you ask an immigration attorney, they will say it's actually a lot more complicated than just, oh, you're working for an employer and your employer puts you at a third-party site. And that's because there's, especially, in my experience advising students on STEM for a while now, there's a lot more nuances involved with that. We've had, payroll companies where they're just the payroll company, but they're not actually placing the student elsewhere. And sometimes you even have a third company coming in that's involved in the situation. So they can be very complex to even understand what exactly the legal interactions are with these companies, or legal agreements, I should have said. So what it boils down to, and what we say, which is something that we can sort of provide information on, but we can't really advise on a case-by-case basis, because as we know, it's a lot more complex, is really that the employer must have a bona fide employee-employer relationship. And what that means is that the employer that signs that I-983 really needs to be providing that practical training to the student. So part of the I-983 is to make sure that there is oversight, that there is a training plan for the F1 STEM OPT student to increase their knowledge in this area. And the problem with placing a student at a third-party placement is that there may not be that chance for oversight and improving that training experience like there would be if you're working frequently with a manager who's overseeing your process, or overseeing your training, overseeing your employment. And so I'm going to read a section here that's on my slide. And Okay, an employer must have sufficient resources and trained or supervisory personnel available to provide the appropriate training in connection with the specified training opportunity at the location where the student's practical training experience will take place. In addition to that, it comes down to a lot of different specifics and nuances with who's providing the actual computers that the student's working on, who's providing the resources, who is making sure that the student is making good progress on their employment. So there's a lot of nuances involved in this. If you find yourself in a third-party placement arrangement, it's not necessarily meaning that you're not going to be eligible for STEM extension. It just means that you're going to want to have a discussion with your employer to make sure that you do have a bona fide employee-employer relationship. And that's what it's going to boil down to. The filing timeline. So in order to apply for STEM extension, you need to be at no more than 90 days from your OPT EAD expiry date. Right now, we are seeing an increase of STEM denials, not so much in the last year, but a few years before that. So you do want to apply as soon as possible. You don't want to wait until the last minute to apply for the STEM extension. Once you do apply with USCIS, your employment authorization automatically extends for 180 days while that STEM petition is pending. Okay, so applying for STEM extension is a two-step process, just like OPT. The first step is always going to be submitting all of the documentation to ISSO, which includes the I-765, that Form I-983, the I-94, and uploading that to the STEM e-form. Once we have issued you the STEM recommended I-20, you will then sign it, date it, review it, make sure it's accurate, and submit that as well as all of the documentation required for the STEM petition to USCIS. We're going to talk about a couple of USCIS updates right now, which includes the I-765. I know there was a lot of back and forth with this. And right now, the most recent version of the I-765 is always going to be located on the USCIS website. I would say be cautious about Googling any forms, Googling the I-765. You don't want to pull up an old PDF. Always go directly to the website to download the form from there, and make sure to read through any important updates on that site and information and instructions provided, just in case they change the address that you need to send it to, or if they increase the fee, or if there's any type of update, it's your responsibility to make sure that you're aware of that, because what we've seen is that those changes can be made very quickly and without a lot of notice. Make sure to submit the correct form I-765, go to the website, and the filing fee is still $410, just in case there's any confusion on that. Okay, so receipt notice delays. We are aware that students have been experiencing extended delays with receiving their receipt from USCIS. And because of the backlog that was happening at the lockboxes, they did release a statement, or updated their website rather, on January 12th to advising students that are applying for STEM extension and OPT to be sure to submit that to the USCIS Chicago lockbox address. And that's located on the how to apply section of our STEM website. If you sent in your petition, you're still waiting for a receipt notice, it's okay, don't panic. It's not a bad sign at this point. Whereas, if this happened and we weren't aware of delays, I would definitely be a little bit concerned. In this case, it's happened to everybody. It's not just students at UMass Lowell, it's students across the country. And so I did actually copy and paste a blurb that I saw from a USCIS memo that was sent out, I think, last week. And I felt like it was good advice for students to have, just in case you may be in this circumstance. So USCIS is advising that you do not reach out to them unless it's been at least 8 weeks. And they're reminding students that you can create the USCIS online account. You can also check the status of your case and current processing times from the website or from your mobile device. But obviously you need the receipt number to receive that. I did hear that a student was successful in getting their receipt number by actually using the live chat tool on the USCIS website. That may be an option, but it may not be if you haven't waited for at least 8 weeks on that. Okay, so if you have not received your receipt, but your OPT and EAD is expired or it is expiring and you're getting anxious about that, not to worry, so long as you did submit the application to USCIS before that EAD expired, your work authorization technically extends for up to 180 days while that STEM extension is pending. You do not need the receipt notice in order for your employer to extend your work authorization on the I-9. You can actually just show that STEM recommended OPT I-20 that we issued you and to your HR office so that they can update your I-9 to allow you to continue working beyond your OPT expiry date. Okay, the Form I-983. All right, so I just kind of copied a screenshot of the Form I-983 so you could at least see the first page here. So the first page really just asks for biographical information, but there's a lot of attestations involved with that as well. So of course, whenever you're signing a form, especially a government form, don't zip through it. So don't rush through this. It's important that you really take your time reading through the form, completing the form, looking at the I-983 instructions on the DHS website, that PDF that I had linked to. And just, any questions that you have about the process, it's going to be important to ask. And that's because really what you're doing here is you're attesting that you agree and you're abiding by all of these requirements and regulations. So the Form I-983 is a formal training plan that is meant to outline your employment information as well as the plans, your objectives through having your employment with this employer, and assessment of your employment or training with this employer. So the I-983 is something that you need for each employer on STEM Extension. So it's not one document that gets edited multiple times when you change employers. It's actually a unique form that's going to be specific to your employer on STEM Extension. It is a shared responsibility. So there's various sections that are asking for the student to sign and asking for specific student information as well as specific employer information and official signatories as well. If you have questions about who should sign the I-983 on behalf of your employer, that I-983 job aid on how to complete it, which is on like the DHS page, it's the PDF that we link to on the I-983 page of our website, the one I keep talking about. That actually explains who can sign or who should sign for your organization. And it is going to be up to, of course, whoever's signing needs to be intimately familiar with your employment and training plan. So they should be somebody who has oversight over your training plan. But it also, they're not going to tell you, okay, your direct supervisor necessarily has to sign this form. So they do want it to be somebody who's familiar with your training plan, but it also is going to be up to the company to come up with some type of protocol, procedure to follow when they hire STEM Extension students. Okay, so one, I did talk about the I-983 and how it doesn't get updated multiple times per employer, right? So it's going to be unique for that employer, but it still needs to be updated and maintained if necessary. And so the way I look at this is, if we look at the I-983 and, you submitted it when you first applied for the STEM extension. And, at that time you had a specific role. Let's say you were an engineer, entry level engineer 1 or something like that. And it's been about 8 months and you were promoted. So you have a new position, and that means, of course, hopefully a little bit more money, but also probably a little bit of changes in your role and in your responsibilities, right? So while there are some circumstances that don't require you to update the I-983, it's always going to be in your best interest to review that I-983 whenever any type of change happens with your same employer, and to make sure, does this form still outline my training plan? Does this form still outline my objectives, my role at the company? If it doesn't, then it needs to be modified. And it can be easily modified. It doesn't take much time, and you submit it to ISSO so we have an updated copy. And that's because whenever we make any change in your CVIS record, or anytime, if DHS audits us, if SEVP wants a copy of your I-983, we need to provide that. And if they review it and they deem, this now has outdated information, you're now out of compliance with the F1 STEM OPT requirements. So you definitely want to make sure that that form always is outlining the most up-to-date employment and training plan information between you and the employer. So I get asked that question a lot. Do I have to update the I-983 if my role changed? Well, the regulations do not specifically say that if you have a title change, you need to update the I-983, but the form I-983 asks for your roles and responsibilities. And if that title change now changes a little bit of your roles and responsibilities, which most of the time it's going to, right? Then it does need to be updated, and it only takes a little bit of time, and it's going to be within your best interest, especially if your plan is to apply for H-1B one day. So this is just a statement that I did want to cover again, because it is something that the employer needs to certify on the form I-983, and I had mentioned it on the eligibility criteria. But the employer now needs to certify on the I-983 that the student on OPT is not going to replace a full-time or part-time, temporary, or permanent U.S. worker. And again, that those terms and conditions of the employment or training opportunity are commensurate with the terms and conditions to a similarly situated U.S. worker. So while you may be modifying that I-983 to outline your most up-to-date employment information, or maybe you go through the entire 2 years of STEM extension and there's never any changes in your role or your responsibility or your supervisor or anything, nothing changes. It's the same for 2 years. That's good, or that's fine, but you still need to report or modify that I-983 a minimum of 2 times. And that's at the 12-month mark. You will need to go back to the most recent form I-983, and you'll need to provide a self-evaluation from the start date of your EAD, or in a case where you did a change of employer, your start date of employment with that employer, since you've been on STEM extension, to the 12-month mark of having been on STEM. These deadlines are not specific to your employer. So it's not after you've been working with that employer for 12 months, it's after you've been on STEM extension for 12 months. And that can be a little bit confusing, because sometimes we have students that change employers right before the 12-month mark. And they think, okay, I don't need to do the 1 year evaluation or the 12-month evaluation. You still do. That's actually specific to the STEM extension regulations and STEM extension authorization, and not specific to the employer. And I feel like, I've been talking about this for a while, since the STEM regs had changed in 2016, but I feel like part of when they were building the I-983, they were thinking that a student could only ever have one employer, kind of like an H-1B. And that's not true. And that's why there's some like nuances with the STEM process and and sometimes how like those dates don't always align nicely if you're doing a change of employer. So from the start date of your STEM, 1 year from then, you are required to do a 12-month self-evaluation, which is going to be the first box on the page 5 of the I-983. At that point, it's good to review the I-983 and see if any changes need to be made, because you need to keep that updated. That should always be like a living document that's outlining your employment and training plan. At the 24-month mark, so at the end of your STEM extension authorization, you also need to complete that final box on page 5, which is the final evaluation, and submit that within 10 days to the ISSO of your reporting deadline. The anticipation, which has been talked about for a long time, like the SEVP portal actually was talked about like in theory for so long, and it's so long to the fact where it was actually surprising that they had rolled it out a couple of years ago. One thing that they're planning on doing is to have an upload field for the I-983 that's available for students to actually upload the I-983. This is going to raise the stakes for that I-983 to be as updated as possible, because if you need to upload it, you're uploading it directly to the government. They're going to see your training plan. It needs to be maintained, absolutely. And that's definitely the direction that they're going, especially with like the 12-month evaluation and the 24-month evaluations, because you're already, if you're signed up for the portal, you're already getting those emails that are saying your 6-month report is due, your 12-month evaluation and 6-month report are due, your 18-month report are due. So they're definitely advancing when it comes to the SEVP portal and having that self-service functionality. And I know that they're getting closer to the I-983 field upload, because we actually have the option to upload the I-983 directly to SEVIS to your record right now. But UMass Lowell, we don't do that right now. One other note is that while you do need to submit the final evaluation at the 24-month mark of having been on STEM extension, you also need to submit a final evaluation if you change employers. So if you stop employment with this employer, you need to kind of close out that I-983, close out that training plan, reflect on what it is that you had been making that assessment on. So your roles, your objectives, what you've learned for that employer within 10 days of your termination of employment. So you would report, I've now been terminated from my employment. Maybe you left, maybe you left because you're getting a new job, and you would upload that I-983 from that employer, which is now closed out by you having submitted a final evaluation, signing, and having your employer sign as well. Okay. So as I said, employer equals I-983. So if you're going to be changing employers, you need to have a new I-983 for that employer. If there are any material changes, then the Form I-983 needs to be modified as soon as possible. So I'm trying to break this down in a way that's easy to understand. So basically, when you apply for your STEM extension, you're going to be providing information on the ISSO e-form of what your employment information is, right? So what's the name of your employer? What's your job title? What's your supervisor information? There's also information that's captured on the I-983 that is not necessarily being entered into SEVIS. So you don't see this information in the SEVP portal when you log in. An example of this is your salary. That's nowhere in the SEVP portal, right? But that is on the I-983. So there may be some instances where the I-983 needs to be changed, but the information in SEVIS is not necessarily going to be changed. The way that I like to think of all of this when it comes to reporting requirements is If anything changes, literally anything, report it within 10 days. That's your best bet because it's very complicated. There's like intense charts that are available that you can print out. But it's a lot easier if you just think of it like, okay, there's been some type of change to my employment. I'm going to report this within 10 days. So material changes, which are specifically written in the regulations, are listed here. So it's a change in your EIN number. EIN is that tax ID number, not the E-Verify number. E-Verify numbers are usually like 4 to 7 digits. The EIN is about like 11, I think. So be sure to report any changes to that EIN number as they change. Usually that does not change unless the company is being like acquired by another company. That may, it may result in a new EIN number. It's very rare that a company's EIN number would just change. If you are now being asked to, so if you are take a pay cut, and this happened a lot with COVID-19 actually. So if your compensation was being reduced, but you were not actually working reduced hours, that's something that does need to be reported and modified on the I-983 and submitted to ISSO. And any significant decrease in hours per week that you're working, again, something that may have happened during COVID-19, that needs to be documented on the I-983. Page 2 of the I-983 actually asks for all of this information. It asks for your employer name, your employer EIN, your start date of employment, your salary information. So it's going to be important to just remember golden rule, any changes, 10 days to ISSO. If you have questions about what it is exactly you have to do you need to modify the I-983? Do you just need to update SEVIS? Do you need to do both? Let us know, we'll advise you accordingly. In addition to those, if there's any changes to your role, to your supervisor, whoever is going to be monitoring your employment, who is going to be giving you that supervision or oversight. That's pretty much a vague statement that's saying if there's any changes that it needs to be it needs to be reflected on the I-983. And that's why I take more of a conservative approach saying, okay, literally any changes, that I-983 should reflect it because we never know who's going to be looking at it and who's going to be making an assessment of, okay, this is not up to date. This technically could be more expansive of your current training plan. So we talked about the form I-983 and the maintenance of that, right? Which is going to be updating if there's any material change, modifying, doing those 12-month evaluations, doing those 24-month evaluations, and just keeping that form as up to date as possible. In addition to updating the I-983, there's these recurring 6-month validation reports. And if you're signed up for the SEVP portal and you're already on STEM, you're already getting these emails saying, hey, by the way, your 6-month report is due, your 12-month report is due. So after 6 months of having been on STEM extension, so it's literally your EAD start date plus 6 months, that is the deadline of submitting your 6-month validation report. And part of that validation report is just confirming that your employment information is the same. So we actually, part of the 6-month validation report, you do need to submit the ISSO 6, 12, 18, 24-month e-form that we have listed on the forms section of our website. And you'll enter in your information. You'll say if there's any changes. If there's any changes, we'll need a supporting I-983. You'll have to report the specific changes on the change e-form, the employment change e-form. And you'll submit the 6-month report, and we'll go ahead and make that validation report in SEVIS. My assumption is that because they're getting ready for students to actually be able to upload that I-983 themselves to the SEVP portal, this is just my assumption, I don't actually know. I'm assuming that students will also be able to make those 6-month validation reports eventually one day in the SEV portal as well, which I think almost might be a good thing because right now, you're having to go through us, which is fine, but at the same time, you've submitted your 6-month report, you're getting emails saying this isn't up to date, your DSO still hasn't done it. So it's kind of it'll be a way for you to know, okay, I went into the portal, I did my 6-month report, I didn't have any issues, I know that it went through. but I would assume they have to go through a lot more testing and validation before that would be possible. So at the 12-month mark, you have both your recurring 6-month report that's due, right? Because that's due every 6 months. And you'll also be required to upload that 1-year self-evaluation. At 18 months of having been on STEM Extension, you're just doing the traditional 6-month report, validating that everything's the same, validating your address. And then at the 24-month mark, you're doing the 6-month report as well as that final evaluation on page 5 of that I-983. Don't forget, so when it comes to H-1B and doing a change of status, I would say to not forget about this aspect. So sometimes you students on STEM Extension, their employer files for an H-1B, they get that approval notice and it goes into effect, let's say on October 1st, if you did a change of status. And let's say their STEM extension wasn't set to expire for another few months. Well, technically, because you're now completing that, you're completing the STEM extension because you're no longer on STEM extension, it's important to submit that final evaluation on the I-983 still back to the ISSO so that you're kind of closing out your F1 record and there's clean F1 records. And so, of course, once that happens and you're done and you're no longer on the F1, you don't need to continue to make these reports because you'll no longer be on that F1 status. But just a reminder for those who make it all the way to the 24-month mark of your STEM extension, you still need to make that final report and you need to submit that final evaluation to the ISSO. Okay, I'm proud of myself. I had to find a funny GIF here, and this is from Game of Thrones. Anyone? Yep. So if there's any changes, that's okay. There's life is about change, right? But we need to make sure that you stick to that 10-day rule. Okay. So when in doubt, always report it within 10 days to ISSO. Don't wait until the last day, like the 10th day, right? Especially if you're unsure of what action really is required. Do you need to submit an I-983 or do you just need to update the SEVP portal or update ISSO with some information? Ask us that information as soon as possible. So just keep remembering any change, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's very not a big change at all, but a very small change, be sure to report it to us and we'll advise you on how to proceed. So termination of employment, I kind of talked about this a little bit, but if you're going to be changing employers, you're going to be ending employment with one employer, then you do need to report that within 10 days to ISSO and you'll submit the final evaluation for that I-983 for that employer. That's kind of closing out that employment. And now you'd like to add a new employer because you left at company A to now be with company B. Same thing goes. So you need to report your new employment information to ISSO for this new employer so we can make sure that this new employer is in the SEVP portal. So in your CVIS record, and we need to have a supporting I-983 form to do that outlines that training plan for this new employment that you have while on STEM extension. So change in existing employment. So again, you have to report if there is termination of employment or if you're adding a new employer, but if there's any changes to your existing employment, so change in supervisor, change in address of the employment of the employer, change in site location, that all is that needs to be reported to ISSO within 10 days as well. It may be that it's a material change and that it doesn't actually need to be reported within 10 days. But again, stick to that 10-day rule to make sure that you are staying compliant with the STEM extension. A change that is a material change needs to be submitted to ISSO in the form of a modified form I-983. That was, again, change of EIN, change in your roles, your objectives. All of this information can be submitted to us so that we can report it to your CVIS record. So then you can see it on the SEVP portal within 10 days, of course, but it needs to be submitted through the ISSO e-forms. So there's 2 main e-forms on our website under the forms section. And one of them is to do that 6-month validation report. So 6-month, 12-month, 18-month, 24-month. The other one is to report changes to employment. So that means new employer, termination of old employer, changes in existing employment, etc. So all in all, if you've attended my session before, you know, STEM is like the majority of STEM is just, okay, reporting. So yes, if you've been approved for STEM extension, that's great, but the work is just beginning because there's a lot of reporting requirements that you've now taken on because you're on STEM extension. And we're here to support you, but you know, there's not much we can do if it's not reported within the adequate time frame. So that's why we have these sessions, just to make sure everybody is aware of the STEM requirements and how to maintain that STEM extension status. So if you're on STEM extension, you're applying, or you've been or you're already on STEM extension, your interactions with ISSO is not going to decrease. In fact, it will oftentimes increase because you're having to make these very frequent reports to ISSO. Keep it simple. If you have any changes, update that I-983, submit, let ISSO know, report it within 10 days. If there's any change, always update the I-983, regardless of whether it even, from a regulatory standpoint, maybe it's not specifically saying you need to update it, always update it, because in most cases, there's those caveats that will say, basically, it needs to be updated in any scenario. Okay, so very serious consequences if you do not report, because it's a requirement of the F1 status. So if you miss a reporting requirement, or if you miss a deadline, you don't modify the I-983, technically that is a violation of status. And so what we've been seeing in the last probably 5 to 7 years or so is that USCIS is becoming very strict when they're reviewing H-1B petitions, when they're reviewing other petitions for a change of status, or you know, new visas at times. What we're seeing is that they're really looking to see, did you make all your reports on time? Did you report all your changes on time? Is the information that you reported accurate? So there's a very thorough review that's happening of these F1 OPT records to ensure that the STEM program has that integrity and that the student was maintaining status. So we're also seeing, which is you know, had been talk for a long time, that USCIS was going to start terminating F1 OPT student records if they did not report within the first 90 days of their with their OPT authorization. And so while this hasn't necessarily carried over to the STEM, I'm assuming that this one day will be in effect. So the idea was that if you missed a 6-month report, if you missed your 12-month report, whatever it may be, USCIS or SCVP rather has access to that information. And so it's trackable, right? You're getting those emails saying, hey, you need to do that 6-month report. You need to do that 12-month report. When you go into the SCVP portal, you can actually see that whether you've done that report or not, right? Or whether it was past due, whether you missed it. And so there's already that tracking that's happening. It's just a matter of whether DHS is going to come in and start terminating records due to failure to report. So it's so important to be checking your email, make sure you're getting those recurring emails that are saying that you are required to make your 6-month report. I even say, like, at the point that you apply for STEM extension, you're filling out that calculator, make sure you can honestly just schedule this stuff in your phone and just schedule those deadlines so you don't miss those deadlines. And especially if your intent is to one day maybe, you know, continue with this employer in an H-1B capacity, it's going to be very important. Just a reminder for the STEM and unemployment, well, you have 90 days of unemployment for your first 12 months of OPT, you get an additional 60 days of unemployment while you're on STEM extension. So in total, that's 150 days on STEM extension. Some people interpret that as, or some advisors even in my field really interpret that as, okay, if I don't use my 90 days during my 12-month post OPT, I have an additional I can use those during my STEM extension. So I have a total of 150 days of unemployment regardless in my STEM period. I take a more conservative approach on that, and I say, actually, that's not necessarily true because USCIS does not say that. USCIS says you have an additional 60 days of unemployment on your STEM extension period. So I like to use the rule of you only have 60 days of unemployment on your 2 years of STEM OPT employment. So as a reminder, even though you have still keep access to your SEVP portal, you're not going to have the same access that you did while you were on post OPT. While you were on post OPT, you could add an employer. I think in some cases you could even remove an employer. You could update all the employment information that you wanted within the SEVP portal. But because there's no functionality right now for STEM students to upload that I-983, SEVP has not provided access for STEM students to be updating a lot of the information in their employment tab of that portal. So for instance, you don't have access to create a new employer within the SEVP portal when you're on STEM extension. You don't have access to delete an employer. So all reporting while on STEM extension goes through ISSO, it goes through our office, and it goes through really those 2 forms that are located on our website. If you are on STEM extension or you're going to be planning on applying for STEM extension, you need to know where those 2 forms are because you're going to be interacting with them very frequently. Okay, that was all I had. Here's some contact information. Of course, we have advising hours between 2 and 4 on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. We now actually have a new way for students to log into the advising queue. So you don't need to call ISSO anymore. You can actually do it self-service between 2 and 4 on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And so you don't have to even call ISSO to do that, and you'll be connected. Just be sure to leave a phone number so that we can give you a call back and we can do the advising session via phone. We're still operating pretty much remotely. But as you can see, I'm in the office today. And so we do have some capacity in office, but most of what we're doing is still remote. So at this time, I will take some questions. There is a Q&A function at the bottom bar of your Zoom that you should be able to ask some questions if you'd like, and I'm happy to stay on for some time to answer. Okay. All right, so the first question I have is, as a first-year full-time PhD student in computer science, can you go to work for E-Verified employer for up to 1 year in the 3rd year of your program and then go back to your program to complete it? Great question. Well, traditionally, if you were any other level, like a bachelor's or master's student, I would say no, that's not possible. And so for this question, you're talking about working on OPT before you actually complete the program. And as a PhD student, technically, you can be authorized for full-time full-time pre-OPT, so pre-graduation work authorization. However, you would not be able to be authorized for this until you had already completed all your core requirements. You just had the only thing you had left was your dissertation. So you would have had to complete all your course requirements and all of your dissertation credit requirements as well. So it's probably not likely. So you can't really, do a full year and then come back. It wouldn't necessarily be like that. It would be you would be going on to pre-OPT as you're almost finished. The only thing left is really that writing phase. Okay, next question. Can I apply for STEM 2 times with the same degree? No. Good question. You cannot. You are only authorized for STEM once per degree. So let's say you did a master's in a STEM field, you go on to OPT, you go on to STEM extension. That's it as of then. And if you wanted to, go back for a PhD and apply for STEM based on that, so long as you didn't do that at the bachelor's level, then you would be eligible to do that. Okay, so hi, so I have applied for OPT since December, but I still do not have any receipt number. Also, I have not been charged any payment. What should I do? Good question. Firstly, I would say don't panic because there's a lot of other students in your situation and, not just at UMass Lowell, but across the country. So at this point, I'm not sure when in December you had applied, but if it had been more than 8 weeks, you are welcome to contact USCIS, and you may want to just see if you can use that live chat tool with them on the USCIS website and see if they're able to give you a receipt number at this point. Unfortunately, there's nothing really that can be done to like speed up the process. What I can say is I've been speaking with some students in similar situations. I had a student that applied, I think at the beginning of November, I want to say, and she just got a notification that the funds had been withdrawn about 2 weeks ago. So it does seem that there's a serious delay, maybe even 3-month delay at this point. I know that USCIS, that lockbox facility, is actually, they're working like to get up to date with that to of course push through as many applications as possible. So I would say hang tight, feel free to see if you can get a receipt number from the chat. And if you can't, then unfortunately it's kind of just going to be waiting a little bit longer. And if in a couple of weeks you still haven't received it, feel free to reach out to us and we can see, what we can do in that regard. Okay, I'm on OPT, not STEM extension, working as a postdoc at the physics department. Is there any reports that I need to do in 6 months, etc.? So if you're on the 12-month, or I shouldn't even say 12-month necessarily, because if you used OPT time, like before you graduated, it may not be a full 12 months. But if you're on post-OPT, not STEM extension, you don't need to make a recurring 6-month report or complete the I-983. That's only a subject for students once you're actually on the STEM extension or once you've applied for the STEM extension. So in your case, you just need to make sure that you have created an account with the SEVP portal and that you are maintaining accurate employment information on the SEVP portal as well. So be sure you review there, make sure your address is updated in the SEVP portal, make sure that you're reporting all your employment information directly to the portal. Okay, next question. Sorry, I may have missed this, but currently the reports are due to UML ISSO and not to USCIS DHS. Correct. On STEM extension, all your reporting goes directly to ISSO. Regardless of the situation, you're going to report it directly to us. Okay, do we have to report salary change on I-983? If there is a reduction of compensation not tied to a reduction in hours, yes, technically that's what the requirements or the regulations say, rather. Okay, question about first OPT after graduation, so the traditional post-OPT. When is the legal date to start OPT without getting into grace period? I have heard that it is not good to get into the grace period. I will be graduating on May 15th. So do I have to start OPT on May 16th or June 1st in order to avoid the grace period? Okay. So when you're applying for OPT, you can, the traditional post-OPT is what I'm talking about here. You can apply up to 90 days prior to the completion date of your program. So you want to apply for OPT as soon as possible if you know that you're completing and there's no chances that you won't complete your program. So I would say apply as soon as possible. And as long as you've applied within, like, before your completion date, or really even after your completion date, because you can apply for OPT 60 days beyond your completion date. Once your application is pending with USCIS, so as long as you've submitted that OPT application to USCIS, you're permitted to stay here regardless of your grace period. while that application is being adjudicated and while it's being reviewed. If for some reason the application was denied and you are no longer in your 60-day grace period, so thus you could not reapply for OPT, then you would need to leave the country. But as long as you apply early, that shouldn't be a problem. Okay, can I access SEVP portal, which I used for OPT, to track my STEM application or employment update? Yes, you continue to have access to the SEVP portal while you're on STEM extension. It's just that the same functionalities will not exist with it while you're on STEM extension. So you should actually, and you should be still logging into the SEVP portal. And actually, my colleague Patrick gave the traditional 12-month post-OPT presentation a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned after getting information from SEVP that it's good practice to log into your portal every 30 days just to keep that password active and to just keep your login activity up to date. You can't really use the SEVP portal to track your application with USCIS, though. The SEVP portal is just going to give you sort of an extension of what we would see in SEVIS for your employment information and some biographical information as well. Okay, so we have, okay, yep, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. So, okay, I have a question. My current OPT is ending July 31st. When is the earliest time to request STEM I-20? So it would be 3 months before July 31st. So is that April? I think April and May to June, June to July. Yep, so it's gonna be April 31st would be the earliest that you can submit your application to ISSO for that STEM recommended I-20. We'll probably wait until, May 1st to process it, or May 2nd, just to be safe. And then you can go ahead and submit your application with all the other documents that you're preparing to USCIS. Okay, as a first year, okay, I already answered that. What are the maximum hours we can work on STEM? There's no guidance on that, actually. So usually full-time amounts to like 40 hours per week. Sometimes it's a little bit less than that. Some employers, for instance, at UMass Lowell, our full-time schedule is 37.5 hours. So there's really nothing that says that there's a maximum amount of hours. I would just say, use your judgment there. Obviously, you don't want to be working like crazy hours just for your own like mental health and stability. So, use your judgment there, but technically there's nothing from a regulatory perspective that says that there's a maximum amount of hours. We will be recording this session and the video will be available probably like a week after this. We'll upload it to our YouTube channel that we just created, but we'll post it to the forms section of our website. We'll also run through those, so the video, the recording will be available next week, hopefully on our YouTube page. So that will also include, the slides that we went over. Okay, question. If we change employer after shipping the STEM OPT application package to USCIS, or during the 180 days before the STEM OPT petition is approved. So if we change employer after shipping, yep, so change of employer with STEM is pending essentially. So what happens there is that technically you submitted an application that says that you're working for this company. We're going to say company A, okay? So USCIS is still adjudicating this application, but you changed your employer. You're now working for company B. We need to let USCIS know that this application that has information about company A is no longer valid, and we need to send updated information about company B. So if that was the case, you would let us know as soon as possible, and of course within 10 days, because you're required to report that within 10 days. And what we would do is work with you to get updated information. get the updated I-983, update your CVIS record to reflect the appropriate and correct employment information, and we would go ahead and send that to the service center so that they can adjudicate the new employment information for that STEM OPT. Okay, what is the process to make my company e-verified, and how long would it take? Will it be completed before I apply for STEM extent for my STEM extension? To my understanding, the process to apply for e-verification is not very long. I think it's just filling out some forms on the website, but I'm not that intimately familiar. I do know that there's been students that have been in your situation that their company was not e-verified and they were able to get e-verified pretty quickly. I'd say, the more time, the better, because they can plan, right? And, they don't have to feel like they're rushed. So I'd say if that's a conversation that you need to have that sooner rather than later. Okay. If someone is working with 2 employers on STEM, maintaining minimum 20-hour status, are we required to fill 2 I-983 or 1? Yes, 2 I-983s. So you always need to have an I-983 for each employer. So if you're working for 2 employers, that means 2 active I-983s. Absolutely. Okay, I joined here at UML as an international student, master's in computer science this January. I was remote student in fall 2020. Am I eligible for internships this summer? Well, I would probably refer you, this session is a little bit more for students that have already graduated. It's never too early to get this information so that you can plan accordingly. But I would want you to actually attend the CPT, Curricular Practical Training Coffee Hour that we're having. That can be found on the events section of our website. It's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks. Hi, if the company applies for H-1B during OPT, do you recommend to also apply for STEM until waiting to hear about H-1B? Tricky question. So I previously, like a couple of years ago, always would have said yes. And the reason for this is because if the employer applies for H-1B, we know that there's a cap, right? There's only so many H-1Bs that can go around. So if you get denied for that H-1B, then you don't have then your work authorization ends, or I shouldn't say get denied for H-1B. So there's the denial, right? But there's also just like finding out that you weren't picked. So it depends where you are, right? So if you file for the H and you're not file, actually, if your employer submits the online form to register, it's actually called a registration now. So if your employer registers you for the H-1 and you get picked and then you file, right? There's no guarantee that petition is going to get approved. So traditionally, if an immigration attorney would tell you, yes, apply for STEM just in case, right? But there are some nuances there when it comes to applying for H-1B, not through the change of status method, but through a consular processing method. And, whenever you have 2 simultaneous applications or petitions with USCIS, it can get a little bit complicated. So I would always recommend that you speak with an immigration attorney about that, and usually your employer, because they're filing the H-1 for you, that attorney will also, provide some consulting services to you, and they'll be able to speak with you about that and what makes, what's the best decision in your case. But usually, STEM is an additional 2 years of that OPT, right? So if you're eligible, you probably want to apply. And that's a good safety net to have just in case that H-1B doesn't get approved. Okay, if I resign from company A in Massachusetts and moving to company B in California, well, lucky you, will the transition time traveling across the country, meaning, be considered as unemployment time? Yes. So that's why I always say, for students that are applying for OPT on their first OPT authorization, or even on STEM, like you don't want to use those unemployment times at the beginning of your authorization, because there may be a time that you want to change employers, or you want to take a trip, like you want to change employers and you want to take a trip in between. You want to have a couple of weeks to take off in between changing employers, right? Or maybe you get laid off and you need some time to find a new employer. So it does, if you're not working in between employers, that counts as unemployment time. So you're continuing to accrue unemployment time when you're not employed full time. So with that, of course, it does count as unemployment time. I'd always say, save those unemployment days as much as possible so that you have that flexibility to take 2 weeks off to kind of relocate your life to a new state. Okay. If your employer is willing to sponsor your H-1B visa, can he do this immediately after graduation, or I have to exhaust all of my OPT plus some extension before I can transition? It's up to the employer, to be honest. It depends on their strategy. It depends on their knowledge. It depends on a lot of different factors. So it could be that, the employer wants to file right away, starting like coming April 1st, because they want as many chances as possible to get that H-1B accepted for you so that they can file an H-1B for you. So that could be the case. It could also be the case that, they want to wait a little bit until you have more experience, because so that, the H-1B petition looks a little bit better, so that they can outline why you really are an expert or a specialist in their field. But technically they could apply right away. It's not always the case. It doesn't usually happen like that. But that's possible for sure. But usually they'd still have to wait until the timeline to submit registrations for the folks that they want to sponsor for that H-1B, which is usually everything is due by April 1st. Like April 1st, they start taking registrations for H-1B. Okay. What can be the reason for rejection of STEM OPT? So it could be anything. I mean, same with OPT. So it could be that you forgot a critical form. Maybe you forgot to submit the I-765. Maybe you forgot to submit the check. Or it could be that in review of your history, your employment history, or your F1 history, maybe they looked into the OPT history and they found that you accrued more than 90 days of unemployment. Or maybe they somehow found that you did not report your employment on time within 10 days. So it really could be a myriad of reasons. Usually if we see like an immediate rejection, it's because somebody forgot something. But we have seen some bizarre rejections over time. And I would say, one of the main reasons for a STEM rejection would be applying outside of the timeline. So not applying on time, or having them not receive it on time, or usually if something's wrong with the petition. Is it okay to work 20 hours per week, even on the first post OPT? So you have to work a minimum of 20 hours per week on your first OPT in order to stop that unemployment time. So your unemployment time is going to start ticking and adding up, accruing from that start date of your EAD card until you report that you're working in a full-time capacity. And USCIS considers, for OPT at least, and for STEM, full-time to be at least 20 hours or more per week. Okay, just following up on my previous question, I was informed that it's UMass policy that I have to exhaust all of my OPT before transit. Okay, yep. So that's a question that's more specific, not to in general, can my employer file? It sounds like your question is more so like if I'm working for UMass Lowell and UMass Lowell will file for me on behalf of me. So that's where it is going to be up to the company policy, right? So I'm actually not involved with the H-1B filing process here. I know I have some colleagues that are more familiar with that. I stay on the student side. So I'm not really on that employment-based filing side. But yeah, it's not unusual for an employer to come up with requirements and policies for who they will file and at what point they will file. Yep. Okay, that was it for questions. So I'll stick around for a couple more minutes if you have any follow-up questions. But other than that, I'm really happy to see a great turnout today. And thank you so much for everybody that attended.